Hello and welcome to Colonial Outcasts, the anti-imperialist podcast that your problematic uncle will be increasingly confused by because we are going to go pretty deep on this one, discussing the European Union and the rise of fascism in the modern era. We're going to be bringing in Ukraine, potential trade wars with Europe, Frau Genocide, Ursula Van Der Leyen, more sanctions on Russia, the militarization of Europe, and German politics. Fun times, but we're mostly going to be focusing on the great leader, or the erstwhile great industrial power of Europe, Germany. Germany, because no one fascists like my people. Round three, here we go. Maybe third time's the charm. So we are joined for our weekly geopolitical update episode by regular contributor Elena Xenofontos. Thanks so much for coming on.
Thank you for having me. It's going to be an interesting one, as always,
Yeah,
to be fair.
yeah, I know. It's
It's
our
an
first
interesting time.
it's our first uniquely Eurocentric one, I think, in a while.
Yeah, it is. But a lot's been happening as well with Europe, trade, like you said, trade wars, sanctions, fascism on the rise. So yeah, it's been quite. It's going to be quite in the center of attention for a bit.
Yeah, and of course, the situation in the Middle East is fluid, but the ceasefire in Gaza seems to have been extended for at least another week. Lebanon, what's going on in Lebanon is kind of also threading the needle on whether or not hostilities will break out again. And there were Israeli airstrikes in the confines of Damascus, and now the Israeli military is saying we are not leaving, like, indefinitely. So the messianic vision of a greater Israel is still happening. We're probably going to be touching on that in an episode later this week. But in the meantime, yes, Europe, Ukraine has been a massive development. And so I think, Elena, though, you're going to have to shoulder, after my little primer on liberalism and fascism, going to have to shoulder the bulk of this one. We rescued a one-eyed blind kitten yesterday whose name is Sally Shears, which is an alias of Molly Millions, the cyborg enforcer from the William Gibson novels like Neuromancer. Anyways, I'm going to be absolutely sucking from allergies for the next 2 weeks from the new kitten. So just a heads up with that, and a heads up for everybody. So yes, but I have prepared a little primer. It's not little, it's an intro for the audience for how liberalism enables fascism. And since there's no strong left-wing movement in the imperial core, especially in America, we're probably going to be looking at a paramilitary brown shirt goon squads in the next few years. So much fun. I'm going to send it for the next 5 minutes. So strap in. I know we have a lot of new followers, and I don't know if we've really discussed this in detail beyond breaking news stuff. So I'm going to have to subject you to some exposition for a second. So this show is called Colonial Outcasts, and we spend a lot of time talking about imperial projects in the global south, but it's boomerang time. So we're focusing on the core countries, and to define our terms, the core countries are, and this is less from a Marxist-Leninist perspective, apologies to you out there, and more from an international systems perspective, but or integrated systems perspective. So the core countries are the industrialized, capitalist, and or imperialist countries, and they control and benefit from the global market and associated institutions like the World Bank, SWIFT, etc. They are usually recognized as wealthy states with a wide variety of resources and are in a favorable location compared to other states. They are supposed to have strong state institutions, a powerful military, and powerful global political alliances. And the traditional thought has grouped them like Australia, Canada, Western European countries, Japan, the UK, and the United States. And the population of the core countries is on average by far the wealthiest in the world, with the highest life expectancy, education, etc. This is obviously slightly outdated sociology 101, and it's outdated because those stats are changing and the material conditions of the core are degrading, and Europe is pretty demilitarized right now, and in terms of Germany, also deindustrialized. So they don't always stay that way permanently, or core permanently. Throughout history, they've been changing. Europe remained ahead of the pack until the 20th century, when two world wars were disastrous for European economies. It was then that the victorious United States and Soviet Union, up to the late 1980s, became two hegemonic powers, creating a bipolar world order. So Europe's not irrelevant. The EU's GDP is an estimated 20 trillion nominal in 2025. And it accounts the it's one of the three. Sorry, Germany, France, and Italy are or were the three largest economies in the EU. So what should be scary for people outside of Europe is this. And I know we have a lot of you that follow from Germany and other countries within the EU. As the material conditions continue to degrade and far-right parties come into power, it matters for you. Governments learn from each other, and an empowered fascist Germany will empower similar movements in your own respective countries. Remember, a piece of this is about striving for an ethno-national rejuvenation based upon a mythical past, like the Third Reich, Make America Great Again, the Hindu Rashtra or Hindu Nation. But see, it's not just for white people. So remember the Indian RSS Hindu national movement that collaborated with the Raj during the colonial era was founded in 1925 and whose leadership would come to greatly admire Hitler and Mussolini. Look, so when we talk about sliding into fascism in Europe, we've got to talk about liberalism. Again, to define terms, from an economic standpoint, economic liberalism, often called neoliberalism, advocates a laissez-faire economic regime. The right of property owners to exercise the power of money unhindered by regulations, redistributive taxes, and so on. So economic liberalism, therefore, easily makes common cause with the traditional sources of conservative politics, the landed aristocracy and Christian fundamentalists. And neoliberalism favors reliance on market forces to resolve social problems rather than methods of state regulation. So neoliberalism in particular is prone to creating economic boom bust cycles, and has other similar issues that at times make life difficult for ordinary folk. When times become tough for the masses as a reaction to times becoming tough for a dominant demographic who lack class awareness. So you can see far right movements as a reaction to times of this, and they lack class awareness. So when this happens, liberalism is incapable of addressing the rise of fascism. And so instead, these liberal states, which would be America, Europe, Germany, try to incorporate fascists into their governmental bodies, just like they do with many other political affiliates. And thus they legitimize the power of fascist politicians, groups, and ideas. It's totally possible to elect a fascist president, minister under a liberal government structure, as we are all seeing in America and Europe in real time. And they will also side with any party that defends status quo or whatever you want to call it. So liberal states will join parties with far-right movements as those are always standing in defense of status quo. And they even subvert the idea of the status quo into traditionalism as part of a faulty thrust for national rejuvenation. So it's not because of capitalism or liberalism. It's because of the disintegration of the traditional family unit, which, of course, was assailed by the capitalist system itself. But, we hear this language throughout all these far-right movements in North America and into Europe. Anyways, in the end, liberalism cannot reconcile its own contradictions. So liberals are eternally faced with the choice of fascism or the actual redistribution of wealth and power that liberalism can only ever allude to as an end goal. And given that choice, liberals generally either sit idly by on their hands while fascism takes sway, or they choose fascism outright because that's what poses the least threat to their own privileges. Social Democrats in Germany, for instance, chose the Nazis over socialist movements. So, this reminds me of the paradox of intolerance. And you only got 2 minutes left of this, guys. Hang on. By treating fascism and left-wing politics on an equal playing field. Again, I'll say this. By treating fascism and actual left-wing politics on an equal playing field, liberal politics and the media allow fascist groups to organize, harass, and disrupt under the guise of law and liberty. But like when law and order are threatened, such as protests, strikes, labor, or community reorganization, liberals side with the fascist groups to maintain present economic and political order. So this all happens at the decline of capitalism. Specifically, the bourgeoisie start to realize that industry has stagnated. So the only way to get greater profits is by exploiting cheap labor and cheap resources through imperial conquests and the plunder of the global South. And since imperialism abroad leads, at the outset to stability and better quality of life at home, the middle class or the working classes support imperialism, at least the liberal ones. And at the same time, there are still sections of the working class who push for socialism and create disturbances. And as capitalism and imperialism continue to decay and become more unstable, the working classes support revolutionary struggle. Generally, if there is a strong movement, which there's not right now. So when the bourgeoisie or the capitalists start to realize capitalism is going to fail, they try to revert society backwards to feudalism. And this is explicitly what fascism was trying to do. Like Mussolini saw fascism as a modernized version of feudalism that could regiment society and force all these classes into harmony and cooperation. He did this, through violence. So the fascism becomes this mass movement because the middle classes and sections of lower classes continue to support imperialism, which boomerangs back on them as forms of colonial repression, which are then used to keep dissent elements in line. Eventually they develop a militant mass movement that seizes power. When capitalism goes into decline, the liberal bourgeoisie won't accept that the next phase of development is socialism, because that implies that the bourgeoisie will have to lose power and their property. So they try to revert society backwards into some sort of quasi-feudalist state and establish a rigid social hierarchy that allows them to continue to rule and own property while enslaving the masses. So Arbeit macht frei is a German phrase translated as work makes one free, or more idiomatically, work sets you free. And it originates from a novel from 1873, but following the Nazi Party's rise to power in 1933, the phrase became a slogan used in programs implemented to combat mass unemployment in Germany. Don't question the power structure. Work will, with no state benefits or social welfare, will set you free. And sorry about the long-winded exposition, but based off the notes you sent me, Alina, I imagine that's where we could begin. I just wanted to define terms at least concretely about how the overriding thing works. Look at it in terms of 1930 material conditions degrading and what this looks like now with the same material conditions degrading in Germany.
Yeah, actually, I wanted to also read out a quote then, because of everything just said, by Antonio Gramsci, which sort of encompasses what fascism is. It says, fascism emerges as a response to the dominant ideology's failure to pacify the working class via peaceful means, requiring openly authoritarian tools to crush proletarian movements to preserve the capitalist order. And I think that pretty much sort of sums up as well exactly what's happening now. And I guess the best way that I wanted to approach this is to provide some historical context of 1920s, 1930s Germany, what led to sort of the rise of fascism in Germany, and how in many ways what we're seeing now take place within Europe as a whole, whether it's in France, whether it's in Italy, but especially what's happening in Germany again. We're seeing the same sort of events, and they're geared towards sort of the same possible outcome. So just for historical context, and obviously we all know World War I was over, and when World War I finished, the Treaty of Versailles, as we all know, sort of passed the entirety of the burden of blame of World War I onto Germany. They had to pay something around 600 million in reparations, which had huge detrimental and economic impact on the German Republic, the newly German Republic. And so this had detrimental impacts, especially between 1921 and 1923. What had actually occurred in Germany was the highest inflation that we have seen in history at 3,000%. I mean, just for context, in Argentina, it's something like over 200, and we can see the impact that that's having on Argentinians today. In Germany, it was 3,000% inflation. And what this actually did is that it created so much poverty and so much hardship within Germany that by 1924, we saw a lot of these sort of corporate industrial industrialists and financial capitalists, particularly from the United States, sort of enter into the German market and sort of flood it with wealth by, aggressive investment plans from these financial institutions, whether it's J.P. Morgan, Union Bank, among all these other sort of major law firms and financial institutions. And then you had all these major industrialist corporations like General Motors and Ford, who essentially were buying out or like had German companies as their subsidiaries. I mean, Ford essentially owned like a 100% shares of Volkswagen. And then you had something like, I think it was Standard Oil, Exxon, who basically had a significant portion of shares for IG Farben, which we know was like a pharmaceuticals company, which then went on to essentially gas the Jewish population of Germany and throughout World War II, the Holocaust. So a lot of these American companies started to essentially own, and I think it was around 20 major corporations from the US owned the vast majority of the German industry. And so from 1924 into 1925, not 29, Germany saw prosperity, but it was artificial prosperity. It was more so economic growth that was being sort of generated by these corporations that were funneling money into Germany in order to create and generate profits for themselves back home. And this is eventually actually what led to the 1929 stock market crash, which is interesting because, again, we're at that point where we are also looking at a stock market crash because of the speculation bubble that's been created. So we're looking, again, that's what I said, we have to draw the parallels because history has a tendency of repeating itself, especially when we're talking in terms of capitalism, because capitalism will always have the same crises occur over and over again. So the investments and all the money that was generated created this speculation on sort of shares of a lot of these American corporations, and this caused the market to crash in 1929. And what happened from there on was that we saw this obviously had it brought about the Great Recession, had detrimental impacts on the working class in the United States, but even more so, it was worse in Germany. And this started to bring about within Germany, if we're going to focus on Germany, it started to bring about obviously a lot of social upheaval. There was mass protests, strikes taking place. People were looking towards communist and socialist ideas in order to sort of improve their welfare and general material conditions. And so that was the one angle. And then there was also the aspect of far-right nationalism that began growing as reactionary, as a reactionary element to the hardships that the German people were obviously enduring at that particular point in time. And so what the corporatists did essentially between pretty much in 1930 and 1932 is start to prop up Hitler and the Nationalist Socialist Party, essentially. And they did this by funneling in money into Hitler's party, but also, actually, I think it was in 1932, they even stopped providing loans, aka liquidity into the German market in order to basically asphyxiate the working class even more, to turn them against the leaders of the Republic, and then inflated Hitler. And we know for a fact that the industrialists, the three major industrialist sort of corporations in Germany, who again were funded and had strong ties to Union Bank and J.P. Morgan and all these other corporations back in the United States, had essentially provided Hitler and his party with an influx of wealth. And the idea was to promote him in such a way so that he would provide the alternative to any possible red revolution in Germany. So again, what they did is, rather than allow people to look at genuine alternatives to the suffering that they were experiencing in Germany at that time as a result, obviously, of capitalism and its failures and the way that they were exploiting the German people following obviously the results of World War I, rather than allow any sort of red revolution to take place, they would much prefer a line with someone like Hitler, who at the base of it, he was a laissez-faire market capitalist. He believed in privatization. He believed essentially in sort of selling off everything to the corporatists. And that's exactly what he did. When he came into power, when he came into power, his first order was essentially to privatize everything. He made it illegal to protest. He made it illegal to have labor unions. Workers lost all their rights, and that allowed the corporations from the United States and the German industrialists to make a lot of money by exploiting these workers and now had no rights. And at the same time, the first concentration camps were actually made in order to dump the communists and the socialists in. They were slaughtering workers that were all about socialist movements and communists who were basically advocating for a system that would be anti-capitalist. So this is kind of what we're seeing take place. I don't know if you want to say something, because I'm talking.
No,
I want to say something.
I just wanted to say a quip that I ended my diatribe on, and that was, you don't need workers' rights when work itself will set you free.
Exactly, but that's exactly the what it was. And actually, there was a saying, I don't know the German term for it, by basically locking away or slaughtering the communists in Germany at that time. They also placated the masses in Germany to become so fearful of reaction, but also then to indoctrinate them into becoming mere followers of the capitalist order. And that's why it's so ironic to see the leader of the AfD, the co-chair Alice Weidel, I think it was, with
Vidal.
Vidal, sorry, I'm terrible with German names. Okay, people are gonna have to forgive me throughout this episode, like if I'm getting the pronunciations wrong. But when she was basically trying to claim that Hitler was a communist and a socialist, no, he was a laissez-faire market capitalist who advocated for capitalism, who created mass profits for the oligarchy, for the ruling class in Germany, for the United States, and essentially almost kind of buffered the Great Depression for the United States by making the German people suffer, and also slaughtered the communists at the same time. And then going forward into the later part of the 30s, it was even the Bank of England that gave that actually provided it. There was something like 9 million pounds. It wasn't even which it was actually money that belonged to Czechoslovakia from their own reserves in order to fund Hitler. And so so we can see how all these financial institutions, and then this continued all the way into like the first couple of years of the war with JP Morgan as well.
Yeah, and foreign banks in the UK and North America would have a vested interest in making sure that Germany would not have a like a red revolution, because governments learn from each other, people learn from other people, and that would set a dangerous precedent for what could happen in Western Europe, and then by extension America and Canada.
Exactly. That's why the fact of the matter is that bourgeois democracy and fascism are two sides of the same coin. They both believe in laissez-faire market policies. They're both capitalist. They both believe in sort of market liberalism. One just is able to have some sort of bourgeois democratic sort of I guess decorum, whereas the other sort of completely puts down the facade and vocalizes what I guess what the stereotypical center-right parties maybe not say necessarily in the open. And what they do in saying that is that it successfully prevents the working class, as it did back then. It's going to do the same thing now in Germany, rather than focusing on the core root of the problem. And the core root of the problem is obviously neoliberalism, capitalism, and the exploitation of the German people by the ruling class. They're turning people against migrants. They're turning people against the outsider. So people are no longer aware of what the actual enemy is. And this is how the bourgeoisie prevent any sort of alternative to capitalism, an authentic revolution that would anyway jeopardize their power, by turning people against each other and securing the interests of the bourgeoisie. And this is essentially what's happening right now when we're looking at German politics. Because again, starting from I guess just go back to obviously 2022 and with the initiation of the war in Ukraine, which has now been 3 years on the 24th of February. From that point onwards, there's the data that we're seeing is that the German PMI, essentially of their manufacturing industry, is constantly contracting. And we know for a fact that 93% of the German manufacturing industries, have essentially moved to the United States, therefore deindustrializing Germany, meaning that small to medium-sized businesses now are getting essentially completely eradicated, and the huge, more industrialists are sort of moving to the United States in order to continue to sustain their profitable edge, given the sanctions and the energy sort of cuts, the cuts of energy and affordable energy that was coming from Russia. So what's happening here is that due to the fact that we're seeing in the United States, we're seeing, I guess, a crisis of capitalism. You're seeing the rise of multipolarity, and the fact that the United States and that their oligarchy, their influence is diminishing. They need to find new avenues for profit going forward, especially as we're seeing the rise of China, its industrial capacity, but also now its high-tech industry, its biopharmaceutical industry. It's rapidly growing, offering like the world actual competition, which means that the US and its oligarchy, Silicon Valley and Wall Street can no longer monopolize. They need to find avenues by which to essentially continue their profit maximization. And they're doing that through essentially destroying the European Union and its economic foundations, creating a situation where they've become completely reliant on the United States. And that is why when the EU sanctioned Russia, it had detrimental economic repercussions on the EU. It was almost self-sabotaging and self-destructive, because now all their industries have left, and it has exposed their economies in very detrimental ways. And now, because people are effectively suffering dire economic conditions and the material conditions are deteriorating, you have the ruling class, which is obviously the political class, sort of liberal political elites, which are the typical CDU and SPD. They, hi there, yeah. So next time I need to bring I've got a little kitty here. We'll have a little kitty competition.
Sorry, if you're just listening to the audio, the new kitten's like biting my leg. It's like needle teeth. So, anyways, yeah. So
yeah, but what I was saying is that the same thing that's happening. What we're seeing is that with the CDU and all these sort of center liberal parties, they acted as agents for the bourgeois class in these countries. They sanctioned Russia, destroyed the local economies, and now that people are suffering, they're trying to pass the burden of blame on migration.
Right.
And rather than the fact that neoliberalism is failing, the fact that it is that their economy has been, that their material conditions have been destroyed because the industrialists and the capitalists have essentially parasited their industry and shifted off to the United States. And rather than address the failures of neoliberalism, it's far easier to, I guess, abuse the sensational reactions of people and guide them towards fascism, because at least the AfD, for example, in this case, much like the CDU, they are advocates, much like Hitler was. They are advocates of laissez-faire market policies. They are for privatization. They are for neoliberalism and capitalism.
Right.
So you people will support them without having to look at left-wing alternatives that will question the authority of the I guess of the financial capitalists.
Right. So let's talk about this Friedrich Merz character. He is the German politician who served as the leader of the Christian Democratic Union, the CDU, since January 2022, and he's now elected. He's the chancellor for Germany, and so he's kind of led like a Washington-esque political career where he started off kind of like in politics, and then he went into the private sector to be a lobbyist, ended up as a BlackRock executive, and then decided, oh, I've made all my money. It's time for me to go back into politics, save the German country, block. I think he kind of wants to block AfD, which is the far right party. I don't think he's going to try to do a more like centrist coalition, center right coalition. But here's the only reason I say that. See, the Christian Democratic Party isn't as far right as the AfD, but they still believe that they can allay some of the concerns of the AfD by focusing on migrants.
That's the thing. So my personal opinion on this is that if you look at the AfD was actually created in 2013 out of
Right.
politicians that left the CDU,
Mhm.
and they therefore there's a strong correlation. And also the CDU, I think, is one of the only parties now in Germany that have actually completely teared down the firewall. And for those that may not know what the firewall is, it has been a part of the legislation in Germany to forbid any major political party from collaborating with any far right or neo-Nazi group, obviously because of World War II. And this has always been sort of protocol in Germany. And now, since 2019, there was a report that I was reading, I think it was from the Rosa Luxemburg Institute, if I'm not mistaken. They've actually broken that around 120 times. And we have seen like actually the CDU on multiple occasions now kind of align in terms of voting and parliamentary sort of positions with the AfD, which isn't surprising given that there are ties between the two parties, which is worth noting. So the way I see it is like the CDU's perspective, that the way that they present themselves as being somewhat more credible is, again, like I said, it's more for the purposes of retaining that diplomatic presence. But they actually both, because at the end of the day, it's these liberal parties, whether it's or center right or SPD, who normalize this language. They were the ones that started attacking migration in the first place, that created the base for support for the AfD in the first place by constantly attacking migration for the past 10 years, at least.
Yeah, I mean, ever since I started paying attention to international politics, when I was like 15, I just like Angela Merkel. She was the predecessor of this guy, and she was also from the CDU, and like she was even saying things like back in like 2010, like German multiculturalism has failed and stuff like that. So they are, but I do agree with the point that they're more socially acceptable. They're not doing straight up Nazi quotes like the AfD is, but I mean, there's still same right-wing policies or similar right-wing policies, same fixation on the migrant issue. And just to bring this home, let me play some of the new chancellor's choice remarks on migrants in Germany.
I think we might have to read some out. Because the translation is there, but for the people who are listening on audio, we might have to actually read them.
Friedrich Merz, Christian Democratic Union of Germany. The daily gang rapes from the milieu of asylum seekers. Jesus. They must be taken into deportation custody or detained and deported as quickly as possible. Primarily youth from the Arab world. With Palestine flags and the call to destroy the state of Israel. We must not tolerate such things in Germany because they have a different cultural conception, because they have different views on women, because they are completely disrespectful in parts of these immigrant groups, especially among young men. We will do our part to put an end to this. So that's CDU. And just to compare that to some of the members of the AfD, the Alternative for Deutschland, again, chaired by Alice Weidel. She is the one who's speaking at the beginning of this clip.
The main issue is, of course, immigration. Much like other far-right racists, she described multiculturalism as a failed concept and warned of the Islamization of Germany, spreading replacement theory conspiracies, calling for a return to a Germany for Germans, dreaming of a fortress Europa. The former co-leader of the party alongside Weidel stated, "We must close the borders and then endure the cruel images." On the topic of migration, AfD politicians have put out statements reminiscent of the most Hitlerite of Hitlerites. We must, of course, dispose of such people. The refugee doesn't care at which border, Greek or German, he dies. The whole development we are witnessing right now, the creation of a mixed peoples to erase national identities, and with that, the surrender of sovereignty to the EU, is simply unbearable. And with this guy, it gets especially ugly. I have a vision now. If things go well in Germany, we will eventually have a kind of apartheid.
Eventually kind of apartheid. This is what I want to know this guy's name. Holger.
State, like in South Africa back then, where whites just somehow keep the rest in check. Once we finally get...
What do you mean somehow the whites keep the rest in check? You mean through overt colonial violence. That's what somehow means. Yeah.
Get there, we'll line them all up against the wall, dig a pit, throw them all in, and dump quicklime on top. Now, hearing the word deportation over and over again might seem almost normalized in the former Hitler country, because it is.
Would you force them back to Syria?
Deportation ist ein Begriff, den wir überhaupt nicht verwenden. Das ist ein Nazi-Begriff und Zwangsdeportation
This is Dr. Bernd Baumann, a member of the AfD.
gibt es für uns überhaupt nicht. Zum Schluss auch mit Abschiebung, natürlich. Das ist Teil des deutschen Rechtssystems.
Sorry, I'm gonna
natürlich,
translate.
das auch mit und Zwangsdeportation gibt es für uns.
Okay, so deportation. It's a Nazi term, and forced deportation is completely out of the
Überhaupt
question.
nicht. Zum Schluss
But
auch mit
in the end, if
Abschiebung,
nothing else
natürlich.
works,
Das
then we
ist
have to
Teil des
remove them.
deutschen
That is part of the German legal
Rechtssystems, auch des
system and the
europäischen
European legal
Rechtssystems.
system.
Rückführung,
Repatriation, forced removal, that's what the police would call
Begriff
it.
bei der Polizei.
You don't like the
Kind of like voluntary migration in Gaza is not ethnic
Exactly.
cleansing.
word deportation because of its historical connotations, but whatever you call it, that's the reality for these people, isn't it?
Wenn Sie das
But when you call it deportation, it has a completely misleading connotation, and we don't want that. Like the misleading connotation of it being factual.
Deportation nennen, hat das einen völlig falschen Zungenschlag. Das wollen wir nicht.
So, yes, there are differences between the AfD party and the CDU. I think you made a good point. It's basically, the Democrats versus the Republicans. The Democrats will fund a genocide while calling for peace, while the Republicans will be just like doing the same thing, except, this is a great opportunity to build some hotels, afterwards. And, and the Democrats would have still probably gone along with it, being like, sorry, Israel's a sovereign country. Our hands are tied. So similar language, similar things, just one is slightly more polite. And yeah, I think that's why one's considered like right or center right and one's far right. I think it's mostly just a matter of language.
Of course, it is a matter of language. Like I said, the vast majority of these parties, they represent the same interests. I mean, when you have their new sort of chancellor now was like a former executive director of BlackRock. I mean, the man's goal and agenda there is to serve the interests of the corporations he's basically working for. It's the problem when you have the revolving doors, when you have individuals that are part of the public sector, who are part of the private sector and senior positions. And again, who are the ones that stand to make the most money right now in Germany? It has become the industrialized. That is the financial capitalist sector who are going to come in and essentially, as the industrial sort of sector collapses, you're going to see, as we see all these mortgage defaults and bankruptcies taking place, it's going to be the financial sector that's going to come in, bring money through debt into the country, and essentially capitalize and generate more wealth for itself, in order to kind of safeguard the fact that, again, like I said, in the United States, there's a stock market bubble crisis and a debt crisis is about to unleash. So they're trying to, like I said, take the surplus from the EU, the excess surplus, and absorb it into their into profits for them. They have to look for new avenues of profit maximization right now. And this man, what's his name? Is it Merz? He's the one that's going to help facilitate that. Yeah, he's going to help facilitate that. Also worth noting is that Ursula Van Der Leyen, she was also part of the CDU. And it's also, I guess, worth discussing as well now with the state of the EU, its economics, and probably Ursula's newest declarations, and the trade wars.
Yeah, we've mentioned the degrading material conditions in Germany. I think we should talk about what this means for EU and the EU unity, and what the new adversarial approach to Europe from the Trump administration looks like. And just so everyone, and I know I've kind of got crappy internet right now, sorry, Alina, but basically what I'm going to do is talk about the EU, bring up Ursula Van der Leyen. And Ursula Van der Leyen is what the former Irish MP Claire Daly called Frau Genocide. So she is not the sorry, I'm trying to pull up something from her. She's not the nicest person. She is a German politician serving as the 13th president of the European Commission since 2019. And yeah, she held positions in Angela Merkel's cabinet and most recently as the federal minister of defense. She is a neoliberal war hawk to the max. All right, 1 second. I'm having technical difficulties. Sorry, everybody.
No worries.
All right. This is her talking about addressing Ukraine.
Dear Volodymyr, Europe is here to strengthen Ukraine in this critical moment. I can announce that a new 3.5 billion euro payment for Ukraine will arrive already in March. Second, as President Costa just has announced, there will be a special European Council, and I will present at this special European Council a comprehensive plan for defense investment, for scaling up our European arms production and defense capabilities, but also for investment in Ukraine's defense industry, scaling up your arms production, your defense capabilities. So this will be a plan for the European Union and for Ukraine.
Okay, well, kind of sucks for them that the EU is pretty demilitarized. Also, if they're ever going to fight, they'd have to do so in a coalition. And if you ever worked with inside a coalition, it's a mess. So I don't know. Good luck, I guess, in their future endeavors with reindustrializing their military base. And I don't know.
But this is the thing. So there's two problems there. So on the first, she just promised another 3.5 billion to Ukraine in the midst of a huge, from where? I mean, the European Union as a whole is suffering an economic crisis. The centerpiece for the European economy, for the European Union economy, was Germany. And Germany is also the third largest exporter, was the third largest exporter in the world behind the United States and China. And that is going to diminish drastically. I mean, I think it was earlier last year, where I think the European Union had to cut 1 billion from its health budget just to be able to provide to Ukraine. And this was to alleviate the burden that essentially was created because so many countries were struggling because a lot of their budgets were being spent to facilitate this war in Ukraine. So this is, again, worse than the material conditions of the working class. So again, the sanctions impacts on the European economies, the industrialization, the fact that all the industries are now moving to the United States. We're seeing, again, all these all of Europe's businesses effectively, sort of collapse, even agriculturally speaking, because, you had countries like Italy or particularly Spain who were focused more on agricultural production within the scope of the European Union, who were also significantly hit because obviously you need energy to be able to produce your agricultural goods. And then obviously Russia is also quite a fertilizer giant when it comes to in the global market as well. And that was no longer available to them. So you have all these European economies that are struggling. And on top of that, they're also being coerced to fund Ukraine. And I think at this point, something like 185 billion, I might be getting the number wrong, that's been provided by the European Union, that is already struggling. And she's continuing to push this towards Ukraine. And this is exactly the reason why things, like Le Pen has been, it's growing in popularity in France, and why we're seeing AfD becoming popular in Germany. And again, they're blaming immigration, but they're not looking at what their political class is actually doing and how and who this is serving. So this is so that's the one aspect of things. And I also wanted to bring up here, even if you look at Italy right now, Italy is also facing it's in dire economic sort of situation. They have a sort of a national debt of 3 trillion, which is at 136% GDP ratio, 136% in comparison to its GDP. And they're also on the verge of a massive economic collapse. And these are the two largest economies in the European Union. And when you have a monetary union, basically meaning that all the countries actually use the euro, this is going to have detrimental impacts. And they're constantly pushing and pushing in order to create this sort of catastrophic conditions for the working class that, again, the capitalists will be able to exploit, because we have to remember this is about unequal exchange. And the more poverty, even within the imperial core now, provides an opportunity for a lot of these corporations to be able to exploit, therefore creating, maximizing their ability to make profits as more people now entering into the Army Labor Reserve. And the second problem here is that she's talking about militarizing the EU. Who's going to fund that? Oh, yeah, the military industrial complex, because the European Union doesn't have the industrial capacity to do it anymore. So all that's going to go to the military industrial complex, who's already backlogged anyway, but they're going to make, a shitload of profits at the same time. So who is Ursula von der Leyen actually aiding? We know it's not Ukraine. We're seeing Ukraine essentially being cut piece by piece now by the financial capitalists. They're basically, I think they're about to enter into the sort of mineral resources deal now with the United States. So they're going to essentially own all of Ukraine at this point. So they're not helping Ukraine. They've also lost their territorial integrity. Europe, and at the same time, Europe is going down the drain, and the only people that seem to be profiting out of this situation are the financial and corporate elite, the capitalists, the imperialists. Those are the other ones, and it's the working class throughout Europe who are going to suffer, and they're also being turned against one another by blaming each other. And this has also happened during the European crisis, during the European banking crisis, which again, it was I actually published my thesis on this. It started off as sort of like the bailout business. Like it was called the bailout business because what had initially been banks, irresponsible lending for the purpose, obviously, of generating wealth and profits for themselves, was then passed on to the working class. And all these bailouts that were actually given were actually to save the banks at the expense of austerity for people. And throughout, whether it was Greece, Spain, Ireland, Cyprus, etc. And so many countries in the European Union were in constant antagonistic relationship with one another. Germans were vehemently against the Greeks and so on, because they were taught to believe like, oh, well, the reason the European Union is in a crisis is because the Greeks are lazy workers. That was pretty much the sort of the dominant narrative at the time, and not the corruption behind the scenes, and the fact that essentially you had all the big four essentially involved in creating the perfect conditions by which the corporations were able to make money off of predatory loaning. So this is how the bourgeoisie works to distract people from the truth, and this is exactly what Ursula von der Leyen is actually also stating here. But there's the other aspect that I wanted to bring up, and that's the tariff wars that Trump is now threatening the EU with, and how that's going to come into play as well.
I mean, does Trump ever follow through on his tariff threats, though?
No, but that's the thing. So what does he want to accomplish? So he's now threatening the EU with tariffs on, steel, aluminum, and a bunch of other things. But what Trump has also come out and said quite openly is that he doesn't feel that the EU is treating the big tech corporations fairly in Europe. And what he essentially means by that is
this is a good point.
Yeah, he's basically said what he means by that is that even though the EU is in many ways highly deregulated when it comes to the way corporations work, they still do have some regulations to sort of prevent the complete exploitation by these sort of monopoly corporations. And so the ECJ, which is the European Court of Justice, just I think it was in September of 2024, found some of these big Silicon Valley companies guilty of antitrust policies, tax avoidance, and abusing market dominance in order to obviously exploit and make generate as much profits for themselves as possible, which is a violation of the EU sort of fair competition policies. And so and
just for context, this came to a head this past September, so this is recent. So basically, background, they got hit with a multi-billion-dollar fine. I think it was like close to 2.5 billion euros, which is slightly more in US dollars. The fine stems from an antitrust investigation by the European Commission, which concluded in 2017. The commission said that Google abused its market dominance, and Apple's also getting heat. all these tech monopolies,
Microsoft.
Microsoft. But we're just, for brevity's sake, just focusing on Google. Concluded in 2017, the antitrust investigation. The commission said that Google abused its market dominance as a search engine to promote its own comparison shopping service in search results. So this is not the only antitrust case that Google's facing. They're also facing scrutiny in the U.S., but the EU court did annul a $1.7 billion antitrust fine against Google, but they still went through with the $2.5 billion ones. Google doesn't like that. They think it sets a dangerous precedent. Also, other tech companies don't like it. In the European upheld the general court's earlier judgment, which rejected Google's appeal. And, they ruled that Google favored its own comparison shopping service over those of its rivals as the massive, completely monopolized search and shopping platform and basically browser platform, with Google Chrome and everything. It's kind of a breach of public trust when they push and hawk their own products under unfair business practices, because they're the only game in town. You have to use Google. So that was a pretty clear-cut antitrust case. Of course, they don't like it. And the current version of the ECJ, the current head, is kind of an antitrust hawk. So she's really pushing for that. And what we've seen throughout the Trump administration with the implementation of Doge, the Department of Government Efficiency, and Elon Musk basically going on a witch hunt for every government institution that's putting roadblocks and regulations on his own personal companies. Well, now they're coming for Europe. It's just pretty much out of their playbook.
Yeah, exactly. So I think it was even Mark Zuckerberg. He actually said to Trump, the EU needs to be essentially dealt with, because what they want to do by imposing tariffs, it's mostly to act as a means of coercion. It's blackmail. They're saying and because the European Union, this is what happened with the sanctions, with the deindustrialization, with the impending economic crisis in the EU. It's so economically fragile. The United States, which is the reason that the European Union is now so weak, is now trying to exploit the European Union's economic weakness to blackmail them into submission and basically coerce the EU into further deregulation. And further deregulation would essentially mean to allow Silicon Valley and all these big tech corporations to completely exploit the market, drive out any competition, monopolize, and again, generate as much profits for themselves as possible. Again, it goes back to what I was saying. They're trying to find new avenues of profit maximization. And now, because of the fact that they're becoming a waning power, again, because of the rise of China and the fact that there's going to be genuine competition that's going to test big tech and Silicon Valley, they are now trying to take what they can, and they're even actively turning against their satellite states so that they can just appropriate as much of that market as they possibly can. So this is what the tariffs are all about. Doesn't mean it's actually going to go through. Well, it kind of depends on a couple of things. Will the EU actually surrender and because of its vulnerable economic state, and actually provide deregulate further in order to appease the Silicon Valley sort of oligarchy in the United States? Or will they retaliate? And now there has been like an article from the Financial Times saying that essentially some insider information some insiders have stated that the EU is looking at using the sort of anti-coercion initiatives. And these anti-coercion initiatives are basically meant to, whenever the EU as a unit feels that their economies are being threatened by external sort of states, whether it's China, whether it's the United States, they have a right to sort of impose retaliatory action. And what these insiders have said and this is sort of what some things that are on the table, some of the options, is that they're going to revoke sort of the intellectual property rights of Silicon Valley, which would actually have a detrimental impact on their ability to service consumers in the EU. So we might actually, it really depends now on how the EU decides to function. Will it completely capitulate to, I guess, the oligarchy, or I guess the sort of the Silicon Valley elites and financial elites from the United States? again, when you have a political class in the form of Ursula von der Leyen and the new leadership in Germany, who again do represent these sort of values, that might be the case. Or will they actually retaliate and start to look at their own economic prosperity and look elsewhere and pivot elsewhere in order to be able to sustain themselves? So it's going to be a very volatile time. And what this is going to do, again, is impose even further economic stress on the working class in the EU, which is going to amplify even more reactionism, and most likely it's going to be funneled into this fascist outrage, unfortunately, in people throughout the EU. And
and so, which makes the whole situation in Ukraine so interesting, because now the U.S. has voted against the resolution, against the Ukraine resolution, because they didn't like the language. So they voted against it in contravention of every other European country who is very much pro-Ukraine. Trump has called, in a very unjudicious tweet on Truth Social, Zelensky a dictator. Refused to call Putin one too. It's just not language that's good for talking to our European allies and saying that, hey, we're still the West. We're still like. I mean, we're not going to call you our vassal states, but we're still like
kind of are.
Yeah, I know. We can still work together because we're all Christians and white and stuff like that. But now, we're seeing the dissolution of the transatlantic alliance that has stood since the post World War II era, and kind of the homogenization of Europe, where there are Europeans first and everybody else second, and there's a lot of, as the EU continues to disintegrate, because that looks like a very likely option, where you're going to see the rise of all this like far right nationalism that's based on each country. Germans for Germans, Rome for Romans, and it could be interesting to see like internecine fighting as Europe continues to dissolve over all of these issues. Like we've already had Brexit. There's a precedent for people just saying screw it and exiting as well.
Exactly. I think I think we might be seeing sort of the beginning of the end of the European Union as an institution, which then will sort of boomerang back to the United States, because the United States was able to, I mean, the European Union was one of the greatest projects in terms of one of the greatest capitalist projects to date, because it brought all these nations together on this, laissez-faire market centralized system of power, of bureaucratic power. And it also was very beneficial for the United States to have a strong European Union and an ally who was able to help the imperials exercise their imperialist control over the global south and the rest of the world. And now you're essentially weakening them as well. So if you're weakening the European states and we see sort of the beginning of the end of the European Union, yes, it's going to generate a lot of chaos, but eventually it's going to sort of isolate the United States going forward. And this is why this time it's a very volatile time, and we have to be very sort of diligent and sort of going forward, because, like I said, there's going to be a huge reactionism within the working class in Europe, and that could go into straight up fascism. We could also see it's an opportunity for the left wing as well to start mobilizing, but also to start viewing their own self. I mean, I'm just saying it's an opportunity. I think there's more potential in places, I think, like Greece and Spain, less so, for example, I would say in Germany, definitely. Each country has its own political climate, which is we're going to see going forward. But it's going to be interesting, because we could see even European nations realigning now, and this is where it's going to get very interesting to see how this is going to go forward. But it is going to boomerang back to, I guess, the sort of the bourgeois in the United States eventually, but yeah, this is how it is. It's sort of like this is how capitalism works, like a parasitic entity constantly needs to survive. And the only way to survive is to constantly monopolize capital. And now they've reached that point that can no longer monopolize capital because of the rise of other powerful industrial and high-tech powers, particularly in that of China. And this is going to generate a lot of chaos. But yeah, it's going to be a very bumpy ride.
And I guess what's frustrating is like kind of any sort of future prognostications are going to be pretty futile because again, Trump is such a volatile leader. I didn't expect them to be this stupid about like this transatlantic alliance like literally cannibalizing itself.
Right.
Like this doesn't serve. I don't see how alienating Europe serves their bottom line.
But that's the thing. This is what I'm trying to say. They don't. It's always about short-term gains. Right now, they're just thinking about finding new avenues of profit maximization, and also generating the chaos for them. Like I said, even the rise of fascism, that's something that they can work with, as opposed to, for example, any sort of left-wing alternatives. So they're willing to gamble that and to suppress the EU because, to be honest, they never wanted a powerful EU. And I think we discussed this in the former episode. The EU was obviously sort of a significant an actor in the sort of geopolitical economy, and the euro itself was a powerful currency. And now with the, like I said, back in 2016, 2017, Macron had actually stated that the future of the EU was looking eastward. So actually collaboration with Russia and China, because they had far more to offer than the United States. You had industrial capacity, you had cheap energy, cheap resources that could be used that would have allowed the EU to become far more powerful. The United States did not want that. Absolutely not. They want the EU to be placated, to be nothing but vassal states. And so what happened after 2022 or 2022 is effectively they completely destroyed the European Union and the European political elite, who is compromised in every sense of the word, allowed that to happen. And again, like it's the working class, it's the people that are going to suffer the brunt of it. But the United States never really wanted a powerful EU. It was always it wanted a Europe that is at its disposal, not an autonomous and actual strong EU. And yeah, especially a strong Germany. I remember reading an article, and I will just say this, by Michael Hudson, and I keep referencing, it's such a good article, and it's titled "How America Defeated Germany 3 times in the last century, including basically now." And he wrote this 3 years ago because of the fact that Germany committed economic and political suicide. Quite literally, to serve the interests of the imperialists in the US.
Yeah. Well, no party lasts forever. Yeah, I think you're right about Trump. Short-term gains, leveraging the power of the U.S. to enact deals to shake and move political goalposts. Because they still have that ability, or at least he thinks he does. So basically, it's just mass stabilization on a global scale right now, without any like solid end game beyond like punishing the EU for daring to lash out against his tech bro oligarchs. Because again, we're talking about Google. The CEO from Google was sitting right behind him during the White House address. So yeah, they're all in communication about this.
It's also worth noting that the United States only imports around only makes up 15.6% of the world's imports. So imports only 15.6%. So actually, by using tariffs as a trade war mechanism, is it really going to be that effective? And I think, and this is obviously a conversation that can be explored in another episode entirely. But the reason why I don't think he's going to completely go through with these tariff wars is because at the end of the day, the vast majority of even if he was, for example, to impose all these tariffs against China or Canada, there's a lot of American corporations that have subsidiaries in Canada, Mexico, and China, and they a lot of the exports from even Canada or even China are actually from American-owned subsidiaries. So he's actually even going to be taxing effectively the American corporations. It's like a war on the American economy in a way. So, and on top of the fact that tariffs are always paid by the consumer. So I don't really think this is going to go through. I think he's using it as he pretty much is it's a negotiating leverage, but it's not even that much of a powerful tool to use because, like I said, the United States isn't really so much of a, such a significant player in terms of like economic trade anymore as it once was. So all Trump is essentially doing is legitimizing reasons for countries to say, right, we need to diversify, which is then also why we're seeing what countries we're seeing, like, purchasing gold at, sky high rates. But again, that's a conversation for another time.
Yeah, it is. And again, where this places the EU and finally contextualizes it all within the scope of understanding capitalism, imperialism, and this crisis. This is the downturn. The capitalists have no choice but to turn against their allies, given their failures to uphold hegemony. And yeah, it's just everyone's gonna turn on everybody in a feeding frenzy. And I hope Europe doesn't turn into a pre World War II like cauldron of internecine warfare like it has been for thousands of years. So with the breakdown of like NATO and the EU and all of these international legal institutions that were created after the Second World War, could be interesting to see what that dissolution looks like. If you could leave, I would, but if you can't, I don't know, join a radical organization or go into hiding or something. Because
Oh no, I'm gonna go back home. I'm gonna go back home. I'm gonna go back to my island. I'm not gonna stick around for this drama.
yeah, I don't know. England, I don't know. England's always been very good at not having any sort of like. I think like since Oliver Cromwell, nothing really that crazy's happened socially.
That's true. No, it's true. I was actually, I think we were having this conversation before we started the episode. You've got to give it to the Brits. They've had 30 years of gradual deindustrialization, especially after Thatcher and like neoliberal policies that have completely destroyed this country's sort of welfare and the material conditions of people. And they haven't gravitated towards far right fascism, except that Germans have just after 3 years of hardship, So, like, nowhere near that. And like I said, I think I've mentioned this before. Even in recent polls, it found like up to 20 or 30% viewed communism more favorably here in the UK. So, the Brits are not so inclined towards that kind of level of fascism, I think.
Right. I mean, I think that's the purpose of the monarchy to provide tabloids, about visions of grandeur and great wealth, while knowing that you will never ever be a part of it. So don't even try. And I don't know where I was going with that. I think it's my cat allergies. So
No, I see where you're going with that. I see where you're going with that. It provides a nice little illusion, but yeah, it's something to be investigated, I think, within German society. How German society is so inclined uh, towards fascism. Not to say that everybody within Germany has a fascist tendency, but how that becomes like the predominant ideology at times of hardship. Although again, like having said that, there were promising movements in Germany, the communist and socialist revolutions of 1918, etc., that were actually squashed and destroyed by the SPD. Again, proving that they're, social democrats are just as much agents of capital as the conservatives or the far right. But yeah, it's going to be an interesting time, and I think many different countries in the EU are going to react in somewhat different ways. But I think that the future of the EU as an institution, as a union, is yeah, it's not. I think it will disintegrate gradually, and we already
in
had
serious
Brexit,
doubt.
and even yeah.
Yeah. So all right, well, that was our kind of dive into how, fascism comes about in general theoretical terms, coupled with some historical context about Germany and German politics, and then zooming out to the macro lens of the European Union. In general, there's a lot to cover. It's kind of a untraditional episode in terms of what we generally do, but I hope you guys enjoyed it. Again, I'm tapped out. I need to go lay down because like my entire face itches, and then yeah, I think my mind's an allergy vacuum right now. So I think we're at the end of our story, and also my internet continues to have issues. I cannot upgrade it at this location because we're locked in a lab. All landlords are bastards. So We'll leave it there. Again, thank you, Alina, so much for coming on, and we will see you next week. Alina, I'll see you next week. And then Patreon, live Q&A tomorrow, and then FAF special episode on Friday. But yeah, okay. Well, thanks so much for coming on, by the way.
Yeah, you're welcome. It was a good one. Nice to discuss.
Yeah. All right. Well, you guys stay frosty out there or whatever when it comes to the fascists, and do what you can. And we will see you later.